Welcome to Overcoming Power and Privilege and Community Change. My name is Duncan, and I'm a community animator with the Tamarack Institute, and I'm excited to introduce our conversation with George A. He co-founded Greater Good Studio with the belief that design can lead to positive behavior change. Previously, he spent 7 years at global innovation firm IDEO before being hired as the first ever human-centered designer at the Chicago Transit Authority. Since founding Greater Good, he has worked across multiple social issues, including autism, criminal justice, education, public health, and healthcare. George is an adjunct full professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. With his co-founder, he was awarded the TED Prize City 2.0 in 2012 and recognized in the Public Interest Design 100 list in 2013. The studio's work was featured in the Stanford Social Innovation Review in 2018, and he has a wide variety of accolades. I first met George at the 2018 Community Change Festival in Toronto, where he gave the keynote address. And I'm excited to announce that he'll be giving the keynote address at the 2019 Community Change Festival in Vancouver. Welcome to the webinar, George.
Hi there. Thanks so much, Duncan, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I don't often do webinars. I mostly kind of do them in person. So I'm going to try to assume that every time I say something, there is a hilarious laughter on the other end. But until then, I'm going to just kind of assume that there is some audience that can hear and listen in on this. I wanted to get started by introducing this first slide here. And just mention that sort of one of the very first projects I got to do in my whole career was working as a designer working on insulin delivery devices. And in that role, I'm helping change people's behavior, I believed, for positive outcomes with regard to their condition, particularly for diabetics. At the other end of my career as a commercial designer, I'm also designing packaging here for Kool-Aid. And if I'm doing my job correctly as a designer, I'm also changing behavior, but in this case, to help people consume enormous amounts of sugary water. Does anyone see the issue here? This is all perfectly happening within the design industry as a whole. This happened in my career across a 7-year span in sort of commercial design. And I wanted to highlight that this kind of phenomena of numbness, the idea that you can't actually tell anymore if you're making good or bad, is a very common phenomenon that happens within a lot of commercial design. In general, the idea that design changes behavior, I think, is actually less understood, and I think it's important that we clarify it, but it absolutely matters who's asking for that change. You could argue this happens across many industries, but it's very, very much prevalent in design. Our studio, which we founded about going on 8 years ago, was created precisely as a critique of that industry to try to see if it's possible so that ourselves as co-founders, but also as our team, didn't feel that same level of powerlessness and compromise that we had when we were working in our regular careers. So to that regard, we've made a commitment to ourselves and to our staff to never kind of make that bait and switch that we'd seen in a lot of the industry, where you might hear about a project for, let's say, a homeless shelter, but the work is actually happening for a fast food company in the background. There is no discrepancy between those two. Everything we talk about and everything we do are all one and the same. I'm just curious, actually, if anybody here has ever practiced piano when they were a kid. If they did, you can tell probably that if you practice, let's say, piano once a week versus someone who practices it every day, you could probably assume that the person who practices every day might be a little better at this. So I would be happy to say that in this last 8 years, we are like the kid who practices piano every day. We only work on these projects that are committed to the social sector. At this point, we've done over 100 of them at this point, and we're really proud to be able to have a fairly clean track record of working with nonprofits, foundations, and local government, all towards increasing sort of social mobility for those who we're trying to serve. The thing that we actually get to practice, though, is called human-centered design. And I'm sure many of you have either seen something like this, where there are little phases and steps, and rather try to present this as being something that fancy. I really want to kind of clarify that actually this is something that probably many of you intuitively are doing, if not formally doing, in your industries and in your offices. But it's worth noting, though, that just because it's called human-centered design doesn't inherently make it good. The humans at the center of the process certainly imply that there is some thought done to that person, but is it for their actual social benefit? That actually potentially is in question. It's worth noting that if you apply human-centered design to almost any topic area, whether there's a commercial goal or a social goal, it can be pretty effective. It's worth noting here that this quote from Bloomberg describes two Stanford grads who were the founders of a company called Juul that created this e-cigarette that has had and continues to have massive detrimental public health impact across the country, started with, I think, their observations around how to change smoking. And in this case, creating a completely new type of rechargeable product. I'm going to just take a look at some of these quotes here. Montes and Bowen approached smokers on campus and asked them what they loved and hated about their habits. The complaints were consistent: fear of being seen with a cigarette and paranoia about smelling of smoke on a first date. Some of this text is covered up, unfortunately, by the webinar control panel, but it says that they prototyped early ad hoc components of this item that they found on a drugstore shelf. This is actually quotes directly from Stanford's alumni magazine that's available online, where they're clearly quite proud of their alum working to create these new businesses. And in reality, I feel like they are doing exactly as they had thought. They are applying all the things that had been in their training, researching, synthesizing, prototyping their way through to completely new products. And in doing so, I think they've created something that has, like I said, pretty dramatic negative impact on public health. But as far as they were sort of trained, they've done exactly the right thing. You see, in a sense, human-centered design has this weakness. And I think it's a weakness that's actually prevalent and shows up a lot when you see work happening in the social sector in general. I would argue that our discipline of design lacks a basic understanding of power and privilege. And I think because of it, it actually creates a lot of potential liabilities for when you have designers showing up in complex social issues. So because of that realization, and this happened to us probably about halfway through our studio's history, we suddenly realized that perhaps in many ways we were blind to it for a long time, and that once we realized we couldn't unsee it anymore. So we started to recognize that perhaps there was an urgency to share with folks some of these observations on power and privilege that we started to recognize in ourselves first, and then across the industry as a whole. Firstly, power asymmetry affects your relationships with clients and the people they serve. So there's a couple of different key definitions I want to kind of go over here. Firstly, the definition for power, this is simplified definition, is the ability to affect an outcome. So if you think you may actually know people like this who've said out loud one day that they wanted something to be true in the future, and magically enough, that does become true. That ability to sort of say out loud and wish something were to happen is kind of a measure of that person's power. Conversely, it could be true that you've said out loud something that you wish to be true in the future, and it might not go your way. That very well might be a measure of just how little power you actually have. So I found that to be a very helpful and simplified way to understand this notion of power. The second thing, power is symmetry. I've often seen that when power is happening between two parties, it is often lopsided, as in it's not an even distribution, and it can change in the moment. So I found it to be helpful to kind of visualize the idea of power symmetry, not necessarily using the term power dynamics, which I think people have often heard or might say to each other, but to visualize it with this triangle, the idea of there being a wide end and a sharp end. I would maybe suggest that if you've ever started a project in your career, and from the very beginning you can already tell that you're screwed, that there's no way you're going to get out alive, the timeline is all off, the people on the rest of your team are not that great, the budget is all out of whack, and just generally the idea that you're not going to make this thing make it out alive. That phenomena, that feeling of feeling sort of set up to fail, is how I would describe people who are on the sharp end of that power asymmetry, on the narrow end. Now, there is somebody somewhere, even though you may not know who they are, who is actually applying pressure for you to be set up in that way. And those, I would argue, are on the left-hand side, this wide end of power asymmetry. I want to kind of go through actually quite a number of different, more like classically known relationships. Probably all relationships are like this, but some classic relationships that have asymmetry almost baked into it. Law enforcement with detainees, doctors and patients, employees and employees, funders and grantees for sure, teachers and students, organized religion followers, local government and the community, leadership and frontline staff. To a degree, I even have a little asymmetry over all of you who are patiently listening to this webinar like this. So it would be one thing to just simply describe this power asymmetry and visualize it this way. But the irony here is that our studio, and perhaps many of you, were here in the careers that you have because you're hoping to serve those on the right-hand side, those on the sharp end. But the irony is that we're often hired by those on the left-hand side, those with more power. So for our studio to show up at all in this work, we tend to be around about here, which can make for kind of slightly awkward positioning, because in many ways there's actually a risk, we think, that creating a studio when it does its work with community might in some ways be actually working in the shadow of the power asymmetry by those who hide us. As in, there's a risk of actually re-traumatizing potentially the people who we are very well meant to serve, but because of how power has been set up, we might actually be making things worse. That is a kind of fear that frankly keeps me up at night, and continues to be a caution for us in our studio, and perhaps for all designers as they think about working in the social sector. In many ways, the question should be, is it appropriate for us to be showing up right now? So the second observation, privilege is not evenly distributed, and so therefore not everyone can take the same risk. This term privilege, I've noticed over the last few years, has really become quite loaded, perhaps even weaponized, and I think it's become a great source of guilt for a lot of folks. And I think it's probably, there's some credits or some credence to why perhaps that people do feel that way. So I wanted to kind of maybe de-escalate a little bit some of the pressure around it, but also kind of give some reality to what I see. So a definition for privilege I would describe as, it is a gift, which I think many will argue is true, but it's a gift that you did nothing to earn. The way I describe it in this sense is to let folks know that yes, it is something that perhaps if you were born with certain privileges, you may not even know it's there, but its presence is easily detected by those who don't have it. So I don't know if you've noticed, for instance, that my British accent, which is probably audible on the audio here, provides me in the United States a certain level of credibility that frankly I did not have when I was simply just in England amongst my peers who all had a similar accent, which goes to show that actually there very well may be somebody who is speaking with the same sort of content and same sort of lessons that I am, who hasn't been given the same platform simply because of the context of how an accent can play out in different countries. So privileges, it's a gift that you did nothing to earn. It's certainly there, but it's not easy to spot until someone else says, hey, would you get one of those? I don't have one of those. Where can I get one? So let me describe a couple more instances where privilege shows up. So this last observation is when you mix the two together. Power and privilege together shape your world. And I think, unfortunately, because of how impactful both of those elements are, it can make your experience on this planet appear to some with power and privilege to be wholly different than those without it, to the degree where it almost feels like you're living on two completely different planets at the same time. So I actually want to kind of compare what that feels like for those with power and privilege and those without, and kind of make a comparison across these four criteria. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a column of aspects for those with power and for those without on the right-hand side. So let's take a look at something that universally is true of everyone. All humans tend to make mistakes. For those with power and privilege, if you happen to make a mistake, the response tends to be, that's a learning opportunity. What a fantastic way for us to be able to accommodate and perhaps even create a professional development plan around that mistake so that we can easily forgive and make sure that doesn't happen again. And if it did, well, he's only human, as it were. For those without power and privilege, unfortunately, mistakes, in fact, the very same mistakes get read very differently. they can be read as an inherent character flaw. And because of it, it can make for really damaging impact across someone's career, or in some extreme cases, actually end someone's life. The mistake of sort of driving around with a broken taillight, as I'm sure you've seen here in the US, can lead to someone's arrest and potential unexpected death. So there are some dramatic impact on whether or not your access to power and privilege can read and make your mistakes be read very differently. Now let's take a look at the next one, migration. The phenomenon of a family or an individual wanting to move across the world because of their change in status that they're looking for hopefully for a better life. For those with power and privilege, migration ends to be seen and get called the move of an expatriate. It's something to be rewarded and celebrated, and it's something that expats do across the world. Have you noticed, though, the term expats tend to be almost exclusively a term given to white people, and in doing so, there is attributes that you assign to expats, which are different than those for people without power and privilege, when that same migratory behavior gets labeled as an immigrant or as a refugee. I know technically as someone who grew up in England, I could actually borrow the term expat, but I prefer that of immigrant because I feel like one. But I know that the term immigrant has such different loaded language and association around it. Unfortunately, the US government right now is having a sustained conversation around the demonization of immigrants. And I think that if you were thinking about across the southern border of the US into Mexico, if that supposed immigrant caravan had been simply called a caravan of expats, I imagine that the news cycle around it would have been read very, very differently. Now let's think about the next thing, crisis. So crises tend to be obviously dramatic and large scale in nature. For folks who are on the left-hand side, the ravaging effects of sort of addiction and mixed with poverty can be called something, and it's often called the opioid epidemic, which obviously is having pretty devastating effects across communities across America. But for those without power and privilege, the same, I'd say, negative behaviors that are associated when you mix addiction and poverty together has been called something very differently for a long time. In many cases, it was called the war on drugs. So one is more of a humanitarian response that has required a number of people looking to public health intervention to say this is something that's out of one's hands, that is not any one person's fault, but requires a community response. The war on drugs, on the other hand, very much has demonized individuals and their behavior, and I think has led to very brutal responses, often with militarized intervention. Now let's look at this last one. This is time. One would assume that time is universally treated by everyone, but actually there is a lot of differences. For those who have a lot of practice having things go their way because they have access to power and privilege, time tends to act in a way that actually kind of expands. It allows you to start getting used to having things go your way. So you start planning for things further and further into the future, maybe years, decades, or even some cases, generations ahead. Now, for those without much access to power and privilege, your ability to plan isn't necessarily stymied, but rather the frequency of things going your way is dramatically different. In fact, if you were to plan, let's say 2 years out and looking for a retirement home or trying to plan for maybe a second degree, you might be foolish to do so because of how frequently your plans have not gone your way. In fact, I would argue that for those with very little power and privilege, it's a coping strategy to want to plan only days, weeks, or months ahead because of how much you've been taught to discount the value of future planning. So with that really depressing state, I think it's helpful to maybe just describe this really great quote that we saw from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The choices we make depend on the choices we have. It describes, I think, for me, a really interesting sort of phenomena that observes how often the set of options you have limit and kind of can make for compromises that you as an individual may not plan to have, but are only available to you because of the choice set. And I think unless you have this type of grounding, it's easy to actually kind of demonize and diminish the lived experiences of those who have very few choices. So how should we respond? I think it's worth asking, because I think otherwise this webinar becomes very depressing. I think we might be able to offer perhaps a way for us to pick our way through this. We did a review of all the projects we've been doing at our studio to try to see if there is perhaps some sense of a framework or some sort of principles that might help our studio, possibly the field, to kind of overcome some of these issues around power and privilege that we see so often in our work. So we're going to use a framework that goes like this. Good design, and we have 3 of them. Good design honors reality. Good design creates ownership. Good design builds power. Now, these terms in the design field actually seem quite new, but we've been finding that actually these are very old terms that have been around for decades, because they come from disciplines adjacent to design, such as anthropology, social work, and organizing. I think these are the fields that design will learn from the most going forward. And I think if design wants to continue to show up in the social sector, it will do its best to look at other fields that are equally obsessed with changing behavior as we are. So let's take a look at each one of these for a minute. Good design honors reality. When we did our work with the Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis, we were looking at a pretty significant hospital complex in the center of town. And they came to us looking for new models of care, specifically around the issues of social determinants of health. The idea that a complex patient, someone who has multiple conditions at the same time, might be stymied from their ability to engage with healthcare simply because of how healthcare has been designed to really treat those that have simpler issues as opposed to the most complex. But the social determinants, as in the things around healthcare that prevent someone from engaging, needed to be better understood. One of the things that we noticed, for instance, was just how the capacity for an individual to actually even be ready to take their appointment that day could change very much by the minute. And in doing so, we found that the ability for transportation to be readily available to that individual needed to be bolstered so that it wasn't felt like it's a perk that gets taken away for patients, which is how it's been typically treated. One of the ideas that came out from the work was actually a new business called Hitch Health that Hennepin County is now piloting, and they're now created as a spin-off business to try to provide in the moment and on the moment, so in the moment transportation options for patients who are of the complex kind. Good design creates ownership. We've often seen that when we are looking for adoption of a new behavior, one of the key components of that adoption comes from the autonomy and advocacy, the agency that either individual or community feel when having a new future path. So in our work that we were doing with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we called this project Raising Places, but it was an investigation as to how to create and design a process so that communities, 6 across the country, could actually build their own capacity to look for their own research and then do their own design work to create solutions that they themselves owned and created. Our work in these 6 communities spanned urban, rural, and tribal communities, and allowed us to really explore the idea that if you give the right type of space and process, you can build on the assets the community already have, as opposed to focusing on the detriments, also deficiencies that we often hear about when we do this work in the social sector. And then lastly, good design builds power. I think it would be a conceit to say how casually we mentioned building power. It's probably the hardest thing we ever do. We struggled actually to find even a project within our portfolio that even gets close to building power, but we think we found one. But it's definitely worth noting that this might be the hardest work of all. We looked at a project with the Metropolitan Tennis Organization based here in Chicago, and for tenants' rights and advocacy, there are often cases where tenants are often left hanging in the lurch with their own apartments because of the relationship and the power asymmetry that they have with landlords. One thing that we were able to note was actually the MTO was in need of some technology help, which we helped create. But in doing so, we actually came across one of the most fascinating aspects of our work that built on the policy change work that MTO had already done. So in Illinois and perhaps in a couple of other states across the US now, a tenant, if they have can make a good case, are able to actually self-remedy their own solution that's happening within their home when their landlord, who's being wayward, does not fix it themselves. So what that means is they can take their own rent money, hire a contractor to go fix that leak if the landlord continues to be negligent. And that for us was sort of a realization that perhaps our design work, and perhaps in this case on technology, can actually surface a piece of power that's resident in statute already in Illinois that for most tenants was very opaque. So in summary, these principles of good design beg the question that when we do our work, how will the work and the projects you're working on a reality? How will your work create ownership, and how will your work build power? With that, I think I am done. Duncan, I'm ready to hand back to you.
Thanks, George. And yeah, I just want to speak on behalf of everyone in the group and thank you for your comments here today. We did have a couple of questions about specifically those last 2 points on creating ownership and building power. When you talk about power specifically, what are some elements that come out of power? Is that the power to make decisions in like coming from perhaps like a social work or program delivery lens? Is that the power to help design how a program works, a power to make decisions, a power to make changes? How would you define that kind of in a broader community change context?
I think that's really helpful. Thank you so much for the question. I think it's, excuse me. I think it includes some of those elements you just described. And I think you could just perhaps replace the word power with agency in that regard, or advocacy, to say like I have the autonomy to be able to make some of those inputs. But I think maybe one aspect of power that I think is maybe helpful here is that if you have the power to actually say no to something, to refuse the input of someone else, whether that actually is help from a community organizer or help from a community health worker or help from a designer like ourselves, I think that's the kind of power I would like to see. Not just that they can speak up when given the right platform, but also be able to say, I don't want it. I don't want this help right now, and that your version of help isn't going to help me. I think that's perhaps a little controversial, and I think it's something that will get in the way of maybe some of the projects we are hoping to do. But I think if we take building power to its natural conclusion, I have to accept that there will be some communities that say we have enough input. Thank you very much, and we will deny you the opportunity to work with us. And I think if we truly believe that building power can happen, we have to accept that being told no is within that purview.
Yeah, how does that relate to, I guess, where power comes into the conversation? Because as far as this is like a very helpful lens, I find that sometimes in a community change context, when we talk about power or ownership, it's in one part of a broader process where we go, okay, at this point, now we go to the community and empower them to make changes, but we've already taken 3 steps before we even got into the room. Is this a broader concept that by necessity has to underpin the entire process to be effective?
I think so, and I think the reason why I'm a little hesitant to bring it up is because it becomes a lot more complicated, a lot more quickly, and it brings up for me lots of tensions about what we value as expertise when we do community change work. In many regards, whether you are an elected official working as a social worker or a designer hired like we are, when we show up, it's often an acknowledgement of our expertise that we learnt through our training or our schooling. And I think that because of the way in which learned expertise gets read, it's the de facto way in which we see and we value as expertise. There is, unfortunately, I think, an enormous discounting that happens around lived experiences, typically by those in community, that we don't regard as being expert at all. So when we choose to engage, let's say, and say, let's go do a town hall, or let's do a survey, or some other kind of function like that, we've essentially said we only want your expertise when it fits our needs, or possibly when we know what to do with it. I think if we were to really think about not just community engagement, but actually think about power as the lens through which we do our change, we might have to acknowledge that perhaps even before we start projects, we need to start having community voice and community representation in the planning of a project. And this is kind of how we ended up doing it with Raising Places. Give the option that if they say we don't want anything right now, or that your premise is flawed and that the thing that you're hoping to do is insulting, we have to be willing to accept that too, which is directly in tension with institutions, let's say like a public health department, large organizations that are well funded like RWJ. It becomes a real pain in the ass, frankly. So for those who are perhaps the few who are willing to kind of have those conversations, I think you'll find a real increase in participation just from the very fact you want to have that conversation. And I think we'll actually see a lot of adoption and their participation throughout the process. So I would argue that, yes, perhaps it's already too late by the time you start engaging. But if you were to acknowledge that, yes, there are other factors in play, backing up before you've made a big public announcement, like a big press release, is probably a good thing. And it's probably best to maybe start checking in with the community that you're hoping to make that change with first before you start launching pilots.
Yeah, before you plan the parade.
Yeah, that was a bit of a long answer there. Sorry about that.
No, that's good. It goes right in line with another question that we got from Amy about the limits of human-centered design. And Amy says, one of the limits that I've seen is that the end user is not usually part of the clustering, ideating, and prototyping stages. Where have you seen end users as part of all of those steps? And what sort of adaptations do you think would need to be made to the traditional process? But one thing I can see just off the top would be probably around inclusivity in language, because as I've tried to learn a bit more about human-centered design, I find often those specific words even can be a bit exclusive if you don't understand the full context around them.
Yeah. Amy, if I can address you like this, I think that's such an astute question, but I also think that you're highlighting the weaknesses that are embedded in the practice because of where its origins are. Human-centered design or design has often only ever served the needs of the business community. It is born out directly from that, unlike something like social work. So because of it, when you notice those questions, say, hey, what's up with that? It's usually because nobody ever said it before, or nobody noticed, or it never mattered. So in design, when it was working for the clients of a Fortune 500 company, getting involvement to the ideation phase is it seems like, well, that'd be cute, or that'd be nice. Or if it didn't happen, how bad can it be? Because I'm just designing the next mobile app for Starbucks. It doesn't matter that much. Whereas what we're talking about here, and perhaps this is what you're noticing, is that when you don't have participation by end users, for those who are the end beneficiaries in those final stages, I think you definitely run the risk of not only designing things that don't make sense, but actually not confronting the reality of those lived experiences that we just described. So in the couple of cases that we can maybe recall that we've tried our best to do this, it presents a lot of challenges. So one is, as we described in the previous answer, confrontation of like, what do we deem as expert? But there's also really practical questions about like, what the hell are we going to do this session? Where do we do community engagement so that contributions can be made? So one of the things that would help is to not make people go to your offices. That would be one thing. To meet people where they already congregate. So in a recent example where we were going to looking at the Chicago Department of Public Health, had a question around designing something called a newborn welcome kit, as in like a physical product that would be given for free to all parents. The idea here was that if we were going to design the contents of anything that was written or physically given away, where could we meet these individuals? We ended up meeting at the central location in the center of downtown in Chicago at the main public library, partly because it was a central location for a lot of folks. We were obviously able to, I think, provide some compensation for travel, but there was already a behavior around having parents, particularly new parents, showing up in libraries already. So being able to see like, where's the behavior lead to congregation, being a sort of like a clue, I think is a great place to kind of start. And then once you're there, the other practical question is, how do I design, not the outcome, but design the engagement so that mothers in this case, sometimes with babies literally on their arms, can engage and contribute without having to feel like they're being talked down to or made to feel small or tokenized, becomes a completely new kind of design challenge. So in our case, we designed essentially like a super short presentation that could work for CDPH or the Chicago Department of Public Health senior leadership, as well as mothers who have obviously years of experience just being mothers. So we had to design something that could work on both. So we did a short presentation, and then we did a lot of breakout groups on big posters on walls, so that if all you need to do is maybe hang up for 5 minutes, see the presentation, and then leave a sticky dot saying, I like this idea. Or if you have more time to say like half an hour or an hour, you can actually engage with the poster, read the document, which is in English and in Spanish, and then contribute ideas and actually participate. We can do that too. But the design work sort of changes its focus from just designing the stuff, which we frankly still have to be responsible for, but also designing the engagement so that others can still contribute. That becomes a really different kind of project. And because of it, and because of that sort of added work, some designers frankly don't know how to do it. So I think it's not obvious, but it is something you can accommodate.
Yeah, and that's something
very long answer. Sorry.
No, that's great. It's also something that a lot of community engagement specialists struggle with as well. Tamarack has a few really good resources on that, and one of them is a recent interview with someone who's in charge of engagement in downtown Kitchener in Ontario. And one of the basic premises that that the guest talks about is going beyond City Hall to actually reach people, because I don't know about you, George, but I'm not often at City Hall. It's not really a place where people gather. So that just the basic idea of going to where people already are, I think, is very important.
Yeah, I mean, we did this during research, which maybe seemed more like an obvious place to do it, but doing research in a laundromat when we were looking at a small like neighborhood community garden, because it was physically adjacent to the site that we were going to do the work, to us made sense. So then you're going to figure out how the hell you're going to do a Spanish interview with parents who are basically bored because they're sitting for the laundry to be done in a laundromat next door. Becomes again like a very different kind of project. But it's the kind of way in which you have to think through, how am I going to get to true and honest reality as opposed to the alternate version we wish was there. So that pursuit of honoring reality actually helps us think through what is the design we're going to be. And therefore, when we think about how do we have people contribute ideas when someone's trying to change a baby's diaper, becomes, well, okay, I don't think we can expect it to be a desk. I don't think we can expect it to have a security check-in. And I don't think we can expect them to have training in design. All those things kind of go out the window. And then you go, well, what should the conditions be? I still think we could do a better job. I think it'd be interesting if we could have I'm kind of making this up now, like a home kit, something that could be delivered to parents so they can do it from home. Then it brings up all sorts of questions, or like, well, how do you get the stuff back to us? Do we put it in the mail? Do we email it? Do we expect people to have technology? All of these questions become harder and harder. And there are perhaps tipping points where it doesn't become worth it. But unless you actively try to think through those questions, I think you have a shallower, more opaque version of what reality is. And I think for those who are maybe forced into those situations, I would prefer that you could admit it, to say, this is the best we got, this is all the time we had, these are the assumptions we're making, as opposed to only ever saying this is statistically true. I think there's a difference there.
That's great. One question that has come up a few times, just because not everyone attending the webinar here is in that kind of ultimate leadership position where they have final say. What sort of advice would you have for people working within organizations who want to see this change around power and privilege, but don't feel that those conversations that they're having with higher ups are really being heard or understood?
Man, that's really hard. I think that is especially challenging because of the fairly predictable phenomena of leadership to be of a very narrow band of human existence. If you were to assume that leadership tends to look like male, able-bodied, cis, gendered, straight, and white, it may be challenging to bring up questions around power and privilege when you have people who are in many ways the embodiment of it. But I would argue that everybody is on a different part of a journey towards self-awareness and perhaps self-actualization. And I think that I found, and when you talk about this work, shaming people into surfacing what others know to be true, but they haven't kind of come to realization for themselves, tends to shut conversations down, as opposed to leading to a greater journey of saying, hey, perhaps I could take another step. There are questions that I've brought up in the workshop that we did in Toronto, that are gentle enough without being finger pointing, but also real enough to be able to say, hey, you should maybe think about this. So perhaps, Duncan, I can share those questions out via email later on. And I've sometimes found that the type of questioning, the facilitated conversation that you can have with the questions that I thought of tend to be right at the edge of being surfacing without shaming those realizations. The other aspect as well is that maybe this is a different argument to make, but to say that if we are working in community change and we're looking to make a big impact, let's say, would it not make sense to try to shift power to those who don't have it? And if rhetorically you keep going and say, well, why would that be true? We would argue that those who are with the least amount of power tend to be the closest to the problem and very well may hold the solution. So wanting to shift for power and shift and build power in those who don't have it is for us a design sort of source of inspiration. But you could definitely argue, I think, if whether you work in public health or public policy, that those without power might actually hold the answer to a lot of this work, which is perhaps hard for folks to wrap their head around. But I think our studio here work with that thesis very much. So hopefully there is some utility in trying to work this stuff through. I don't think it's obvious how you're supposed to do it. I would certainly appreciate being able to help in any way if we could, if that would be of any assistance, but it certainly requires, I think, some strategy. I also might say that there are probably other people who feel that within your organization. I would be surprised if you are an isolated phenomenon of saying like, hey, we should change something about this. Maybe seeking out allies and maybe thinking about what has worked and hasn't worked in the past might be a good first step.
That's great. I really appreciate those comments, because that is something that I think a lot of people here will resonate with, that the idea that, well, this is something I feel and I want, but I don't necessarily feel empowered to do anything about it. So that's a really important point to address.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it kind of butts up against that principle of organizing, which is that there are probably always going to be someone else like you who feel it, but you may not visibly identify as being an ally. So it could be other people who work in different departments. There could be people who have drastically different levels of hierarchy, but have also had the same feeling. Organizing as a discipline, I think, draws upon finding kinship with folks who don't look like they should. And I think if you think about that principle, you can think, who else actually has these same feelings? How can I signal that this is something we should talk about, and kind of bring them to you or go find them? And I think you might actually find a lot of momentum in seeking out that other person or many people that are having similar feelings.
That's perfect. We just have time for a couple more questions here. I have a question from Roya. They ask, are there any particular practices you do at the beginning of a project or relationship to overtly or explicitly recognize and name the different forms of power and privilege that people are bringing?
You know, we just came up with something, which is a little embarrassing considering I'm the person who's supposed to be talking about this stuff. We've actually just been, as a studio, really intuitively doing this stuff. And I think partly because this is not a cop-out, but I do think that part of our training has been doing design work as it typically always was. And I think these last 8 years has been a huge journey for us to work out how much do we abandon typical human-centered design and adapt it where it no longer looks like it anymore. So that's to say part of why we've taken so long. The most recent thing that we just developed was actually a taking stock of power worksheet, which I have to still refine. But it basically asks a series of questions. Firstly, how did this project come about? And I think this is why, to answer your question, we should do this at the beginning. How did this project come about? What was the origin of it? Secondly, who do we, either as a design team or as an individual who's working on the project, who do we have power over? Who do we have power asymmetry over? And then conversely, who has power asymmetry over us? Another question, who holds the most power in this either relationship or in this project? Probably the project's more useful. I mean, you can already tell this is like nudging on power mapping exercises that organizers do in general, but I think that pursuit is a little different and frankly pretty complicated. So this is quickly trying to make that assessment. The second question, the next question might be, how would you describe your ideal power distribution? As in, at the end of the project, where would you like everything to lie? And then lastly, there's one about what role has power played or is playing in the project right now? So that worksheet and that exercise, we think there's a lot of utility in doing it at the beginning of a project, although we've never formally ever done it yet. But I think we've intuitively asked these questions of ourselves, partly when we do something we call a gut check, which is a question that we kind of go through before taking on projects. But as a design team, I sadly would say we've never done it. But I think maybe as a spoiler, Duncan, hopefully when we get to do this in Vancouver, I might be able to bring up some of this stuff with me and start with getting a chance to work with your community with these tools, because I think it's something that's necessary. If you were to really look at it, and probably more satisfying as an answer is to not look at us and maybe take a look at some other studios who do this well. There's a group called Design Impact out of Cincinnati that we have a lot of respect for. There's also a team and actually an individual called, her name is Carroll. She has a studio as well. She does a lot of work around design and equity. And there's a couple of other folks, but there are just a small handful who I think really are thinking about power overtly and thinking about its role within how design is played within now what we would call sort of social design and social innovation. I'm sorry to not have a more satisfying answer than that, but that's kind of where we are right now.
No, that's a great start, and it's a good transition. One of the things I wanted to ask you, George, was kind of what's next, but also, as we mentioned, you're going to be providing the keynote address at the Community Change Festival in Vancouver, which is running from September 30th to October 3rd. What can we expect from our time with you in Vancouver?
This sounded more like a TV show. This is so funny. I know, it's great. Well, hold your horses. So I think that we're going to be able to get into a really interesting discussion around how to shift for power, or how do we build power. So if you look at that last principle, good design builds power, I would like to think through with folks why we do it, how to do it, and what some of the principles might be on doing it itself. And I think if there is time to do an exercise with community at the session, is to help people think through the next upcoming moment where a power shift is necessary, and try to help them work through an exercise using those principles. Again, this is all fairly new right now, like new hot off the press thinking for us. Even though we practice it, I think intuitively, formally calling it a thing and then giving a workshop on it is a different step. And I think we're finally there for the building power part. So I'm really excited to be able to work with folks. I think when I was there last year, I had a blast. It was so fun to work with such an engaged room who are really ready for the kind of conversation that we had. And I'm just excited to be able to work with such a room again who showed up in that way.
Yeah, and I asked just because the time you spent with us in Toronto at the first Community Change Festival, I think was very impactful for people, because along with going through this talk about, okay, what is privilege, what is power, and what are some principles that we need to keep in mind as we do this work, we did spend a good bit of time going through and practically calling out within our own practices, okay, what does that actually look like in my work, and what can I do about it? And sitting around the table with other people going through the same process. And that's a really powerful thing, because as you mentioned, this is something that I think a lot of us think through, but not in an explicit way. And we don't often take the time to call it out and to identify it and to try to figure out, what are the practical next steps. So I think that's one of the biggest values of this exercise, and I'm looking forward to doing that in Vancouver.
Yeah, I mean, Duncan, it's funny. I feel like I had a lot of anxiety about presenting power work to the social sector in general, because we don't, as a discipline, we're not that familiar with it. And when I wrote about this a couple of years ago and ended up with a piece that I've now used to kind of build workshops and talks around, the response from all the designers I heard was like, "Oh my God, I've never heard anything like this. Like, my mind is blown." And then all the people from the social sector that I knew, they wrote to say, "That's cute. Like, nice try. Welcome to the party, and I'm really glad you're here. But like, come on, man. Like, let's get with the program." So I appreciate that there may be in some cases, reminders, but I wouldn't assume it wasn't present. But I think perhaps one of the things we're trying to do is bring it top of mind again, let you see it from a perspective that isn't yours, and then see how we can make it practical as opposed to just a thing to be in the background. I think it has actually fairly practical impact in the work that we do. So that's why we think we can contribute to this conversation, not because we don't think it's happening, but rather we think we might just have an interesting take on it.
That's great. Now, before we say goodbye for today, I do have just a quick announcement. As I mentioned, the Community Change Festival is a 3.5-day event taking place from September 30th to October 3rd in Vancouver, BC. And if you join us, you'll be able to sit in a keynote presentation from George, as we said, kind of going deeper into this content and looking practically at some of those ways that we can do that last bit, that building power, which I think will be very, for lack of a better term, powerful. On top of that keynote, you'll be able to join community change makers from near and far to deepen your knowledge of the 5 practices that Tamarack has identified that are helpful to move your community change agenda from idea to action to impact. And some of those are on the screen here. We have evaluating impact, collective impact, community engagement, collaborative leadership, and community innovation, as well as lots of immersive city learning experiences in Vancouver, as well as lots of opportunity for peer learning. Now, George's keynote was one of the big highlights from our Community Change Festival last year, but those immersive city learning experiences are also a very powerful thing as well. If you're interested in learning more about the Community Change Festival, you can visit us at tamarackcommunity.ca. George, I think we also had a slide about how people can get in touch with you.
Oh, right. Yes, all I was going to say is if you have questions or feedback, please email me or just send a tweet to us at greatergood_ or George at greatergoodstudio.com. Happy to hear any comments you might have, or pushback or critique or edits or comments. Whatever you have would be great and fine by us. Thank you.
Perfect. So as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, tomorrow you will be receiving a follow-up email that features a full recording of today's call, as well as relevant links and a copy of the slides. If you want to learn more and check out some of our other upcoming learning opportunities, including workshops and free webinars like this one, again, you can visit us at tamarackcommunity.ca. We also would encourage you to take a quick survey that we have as you exit this webinar. It's just 3 or 4 questions, and it would really help us identify some future topics that you think would be helpful to learn from. Thanks again to George from Greater Good Studio for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Duncan. Thank you, everyone at Tamarack, and hopefully we'll see you all soon in Vancouver.